History books mark 1865 as the end of the American Civil War. The Union had emerged victorious. Slavery was abolished. Freedom, they say, had arrived. But the truth is far more complex. As the last battles ended, a new, quieter war began, not fought on open fields, but in the homes, streets, and hearts of people trying to claim the freedom that had been promised. African Americans faced violent resistance as white supremacist groups rose in the shadows, determined to restore control and terrorize those seeking justice. Homes were burned, families attacked, and entire communities were threatened. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan spread fear through intimidation, lynching, and systematic violence. Black communities organized themselves in response, forming networks of support, mutual aid, and, in some cases, self-defense to survive in a world where the law often offered little protection. Economic oppression became another battlefield. Freedmen and women faced sharecropping, exploitative labor contracts, and black codes designed to limit their mobility, independence, and opportunity. Education, political participation, and basic human rights became daily struggles. Every small victory was hard-won. This post-war struggle, Reconstruction's unfinished war, shaped generations. It forged resilience, courage, and determination against forces that wanted to erase newly gained freedoms. It's a story rarely told in textbooks, often reduced to political summaries, while the human suffering and resistance fade into the margins. Tonight, we bring this hidden war into focus. The battles fought after the guns went silent reveal not only the cruelty of oppression, but the enduring strength of those who refused to be silenced. If you believe history deserves to be told in full, honestly, humanly, and courageously, subscribe, like, and share this story. Because the most important battles are not always the ones remembered. In 1865, the long and devastating American Civil War finally came to an end. Across the southern United States, the collapse of the Confederacy signaled the end of a system that had controlled millions of lives for generations. For more than 4 million enslaved African Americans, the meaning of that moment was profound. The world they had known was suddenly changing. With the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, slavery was officially abolished. For the first time in American history, millions of people who had been treated as property were now legally recognized as free human beings. But freedom was not simply declared, it had to be lived. Across plantations, words of emancipation spread slowly but powerfully. Some people learned the news from Union soldiers passing through towns. Others heard it through whispers carried from one community to another. When the reality finally settled in, many did something simple yet historic. They walked away. Men, women, and children stepped off the land where they had been forced to labor for years. Some traveled only a few miles. Others began long journeys across states, searching for family members who had been sold away years earlier. During slavery, parents, spouses, and children had often been separated without warning. Now thousands began the difficult search to rebuild families that had been broken apart. At the same time, newly freed communities moved quickly to shape their own future. Churches were organized, becoming centers of spiritual life and leadership. Schools were established wherever teachers and books could be found, as education became one of the most urgent priorities. For a brief moment, the possibility of a new society seemed within reach. But freedom arrived in a country still wounded by war. Beneath the celebrations and hope, anger and resistance remained, and the struggle to protect that freedom was only beginning. In the years immediately following the American Civil War, the United States entered one of the most fragile chapters in its history. The fighting had stopped, but the nation was still struggling to rebuild itself. To protect the new rights promised after the war, federal troops were stationed across the southern states. Their presence was meant to enforce the new laws and maintain order in a region still unsettled by defeat and social upheaval. This period became known as the Reconstruction era. For a brief moment, the country witnessed a dramatic expansion of democracy. African American men began voting in large numbers. Communities organized politically, and black leaders were elected to local, state, and even national offices. Schools for formerly enslaved families began appearing across the South, often built through determination and community effort. Education became a symbol of a future that had long been denied. For many newly freed citizens, these changes represented the first real glimpse of equality under the law. Town meetings, churches, and schools became places where communities began shaping their own destiny. But the transformation of society also produced fierce resistance. As the years passed, the protection offered by federal soldiers slowly weakened. In the countryside and small towns, where law enforcement was often limited or sympathetic to the old order, a dangerous vacuum began to form. Into that vacuum stepped secret organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. Operating mostly at night, these groups used intimidation and violence to undermine the new freedoms that had emerged during Reconstruction. Their goal was not simply fear, it was control. Night riders appeared on rural roads. Homes were threatened. Communities lived under constant tension, never certain when danger might arrive. It was not a declared war, but in many places, it became a quiet and relentless struggle for survival and dignity. What many traditional accounts overlook is that the newly freed communities of the post-war South were not passive victims of violence. They resisted, they organized, and in many cases, they defended themselves with determination. In the years following the American Civil War, thousands of African American men who had served in the United States colored troops returned home with military experience and a deep understanding of what freedom was worth. These veterans often became leaders within their communities, helping organize protection for towns and rural settlements that were facing constant intimidation. Local networks quickly formed. Families shared warnings when danger approached. Riders carried messages between nearby communities, alerting others when suspicious groups were moving through the countryside. These informal systems of communication helped people prepare, gather, and sometimes avoid violent encounters before they escalated. Churches became more than places of worship. They served as centers of leadership, strategy, and community planning. Inside these wooden buildings, people discussed safety, organized patrols, and demanded that the promises made after the war be protected by law. Freed citizens also turned to the federal government for help. They wrote petitions, testified about attacks, and called on Washington to uphold the rights that had been granted during Reconstruction. For a time, the government responded. In the early 1870s, the United States Congress passed the Enforcement Acts, a series of laws designed to stop organized intimidation and restore order. Federal authorities launched investigations and arrested hundreds of individuals involved in coordinated violence. Troops and federal marshals moved into troubled regions to break up the networks responsible. For a brief moment, it appeared that the shadow war spreading through the South might finally be brought under control. But political momentum in Washington was beginning to weaken. As national attention shifted, the determination to enforce these protections slowly began to fade. By 1877, the fragile balance that had protected Reconstruction was beginning to collapse. For more than a decade after the American Civil War, federal troops had remained in parts of the South to enforce new laws and protect the rights of newly freed citizens. Their presence had made it possible, though difficult, for a new political and social order to begin taking shape. But national priorities were shifting. Political compromise in Washington led to the withdrawal of federal troops from South, an agreement closely tied to the contested election that culminated in the Compromise of 1877. With that decision, the period known as the Reconstruction era effectively came to an end. The consequences unfolded slowly but steadily. Without consistent federal enforcement, many of the gains made in the years after the war began to erode. Voting rights that had once been protected were increasingly restricted through new laws, complicated registration systems, and local barriers designed to discourage participation. Political power shifted again as the institutions that had briefly opened to black leadership narrowed once more. At the same time, a system of legally enforced separation, later known as the Jim Crow laws, began spreading across southern states. Public spaces, transportation, schools, and civic life were reorganized along strict racial lines. For many families, survival requires silence, Communities that had once organized openly now lived with the memory of years of intimidation and uncertainty. The violence that had marked the earlier years of Reconstruction did not disappear entirely, but it faded from national attention. And so the conflict that had followed the Civil War slowly slipped out of the country's public memory. It rarely appeared in textbooks, not because it never happened, but because telling that story required confronting difficult questions about freedom, justice, and the unfinished work of rebuilding a nation after war. When people think about the American Civil War, they often imagine a conflict that ended in 1865 when the armies stopped fighting. Cannons fell silent, peace agreements were signed, and the nation began rebuilding. On paper, the war was over. But history rarely ends as neatly as the dates printed in textbooks. What followed the war was a deeper struggle, one that was not fought between two opposing nations, but within a single society trying to redefine itself. The central question was no longer simply about ending slavery. It was about something even more complicated: what freedom would actually mean in everyday life. The passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution legally abolished slavery, and later the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution and 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution promised citizenship and voting rights. Together, these laws reshaped the constitutional framework of the United States. Yet laws alone could not instantly transform attitudes, institutions, or economic realities that had developed over generations. For millions of newly freed families, the end of the Civil War marked the beginning of a long effort to secure dignity, safety, and equal protection under the law. Communities built schools, churches, and businesses while navigating a landscape filled with resistance and uncertainty. Understanding this hidden chapter helps explain many of the developments that followed in American history, from debates about voting rights and citizenship to the continuing effort to ensure that constitutional promises are fully realized. History is often told through dramatic turning points: wars declared, battles fought, treaties signed. But some of the most important chapters unfold quietly, in the years after the headlines disappear. Because the true measure of freedom is not only found in the moment a war ends. Sometimes it is revealed in the long, determined struggle that continues long afterward.